this work? There we go. Hi, I'm Alan Freeman. This sort of feels like my old days as a litigator when I'd be sitting at counsel table and it was just me and my client. We were expecting a few others today, so I think we're gonna have to handle it. I am the Chief Strategy Officer and General Counsel at Uncommon Cures. We are a rare disease clinical trial company, about 3 years old, based in Chevy Chase. Over the course of the panel, we'll get into a little more detail about what that means, but I always stress at these discussions, I am not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, I have a 10th grade MCPS chemistry background, but I spent about 25 years in big law at a law firm on K Street downtown doing corporate litigation. So that's the professional perspective I bring to this very important topic.
My name is Michael States, and I am here as a patient advocate. Do you want me to just do my story now, or?
I think we'll get into a little bit more kind of background of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's who I am.
We'll hear a lot more from Michael in a little bit. He is definitely the most important person on this panel because everything that we do, anyone else on the panel does, is ultimately geared towards the patients. So just to kind of get us started in the conversation and kind of ground ourselves in what are we really talking about, what are we going to be dealing with in this panel, let's look at the landscape of rare disease today. There's about 300 million people living with rare diseases globally. So even though the diseases themselves are individually rare, this is overall a very large community and definitely something that deserves a lot more attention than sometimes it gets from the pharmaceutical industry, biotech, and even diagnostic companies. The incidence rate for a disease to be considered rare is about 1 in 2,000 in the population, so definitely a very low incidence rate and therefore difficult to capture, identify, diagnose these patients. 70% of rare diseases start in childhood, so again, it's very important to catch these things early because they can have lifelong effects on the patients that suffer with them. 72% of rare diseases are genetic. That can make it in some ways easier to identify if you can figure out the genetic component, but also can make it challenging because those testing modalities aren't widely available to everybody. 1 out of 5 cancers is a rare disease, so it's not just that rare diseases are things you've never heard of. Many times it's something you have heard of, which is cancer, but a very rare cancer can be considered a rare disease. And unfortunately, 5 years is the average time from onset of symptoms to an actual diagnosis for most rare diseases, and that is a very long time that people are suffering and they're confused about what's going on. They want some guidance, they want some community, and it's a very long time. So we're here as a panel and as a community to see what we can do to improve that and make that better across rare diseases. With that, I will ask Michael now if you want to go ahead and just kind of let us know what your story is, what your experience is, and I feel like one of the things that is most exciting about this is that you've been through the whole gamut from the symptoms, the confusion, the not knowing, the isolation, but then you were able to find a clinical trial, you were able to find a treatment that now benefits you, and a treatment that is developed by a company based right here in Germantown. So I think that it's rare in rare diseases to have success stories, unfortunately, but I think that hearing from your experience, everyone here would benefit from seeing not just that there is a real problem to address, but also that there's some hope. So take it away.
So in very early spring of 2001, my voice started becoming progressively weaker. After several weeks of this, I went to my physician. Because of the time of year, he thought it was probably seasonal allergies. So I was treated for that for several months. My voice kept getting worse. He referred me to a local ENT. Their first thought was maybe this is acid reflux, and so I was treated for that for a number of months. Voice kept getting worse. Thought maybe at this point it was a laryngeal fungal infection, so I was treated for that to no avail. And at this point, I was even starting to have trouble breathing, and so the doctor said, I think we needed to go to the OR and do a biopsy so we know what we're dealing with. I was very fortunate. That was only about a 10-month process about 5 years. That's very typical. We did the biopsy, found out that I had respiratory papillomatosis. That's a mouthful. Soon to be re-diagnosed as recurrent respiratory papillomatosis, RRP, which is a rare disease. At the time that I was diagnosed, the only management was surgery. When the vocal cords became bulked enough from the growths, when the airway was constricted enough, you would go in and have surgery. And then wait for all of this to happen again. The intervals between surgeries varied. In my case, there was a period I was having surgery every 4 to 6 weeks. I've lost track, but I know during the course of treatment, I've had well over 50 surgeries. Because of the repeated surgeries, because of the progression of the disease, my voice, I know it's not perfect now, but you can hear me. 3, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, with this microphone, you would have not been able to understand what I'm saying. That affected me in a lot of ways. Professionally, I'm a dentist and had a really hard time talking to patients. My assistant basically became my interpreter, particularly after COVID hit, when we were wearing double masks, face shields, and air purifiers going. My assistant was doing all the talking at that point. Some of the sillier things, I stopped going through drive-thrus a long time ago because the person on the other side couldn't hear me. I stopped answering the phone. The person on the other side either couldn't understand me or they thought I was an elderly woman because my voice was so high-pitched and scratchy. And I just got tired of being called ma'am. Socially, I tried to do anything I could to avoid social situations. It was very awkward for my family and friends to understand me, and awkward for them to keep asking me to repeat myself. Awkward and exhausting for me to have to repeat myself over and over again. So I just became a recluse. That changed in summer of 2022. I was very fortunate to take part in a trial at NIH testing a new immunotherapy for RRP developed by a company in Germantown, Precigen. The trial was a success. They received FDA approval for this drug sometime in 2025, and it's now marketed as Papzimios. And I haven't had a surgery since April of 2022. So I'm very excited. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about rare diseases. My story has a very happy ending. There are so many people out there that don't have that yet. I was the beneficiary of a lot of hard work, insight, and boldness by a Maryland company. And I just want to share my excitement with you. Thank you.
That's amazing. Thank you, Michael, so much for sharing that story with us. I think, it takes such strength to go through what you've gone through and, to come here and share your experience with everyone here. I think it's incredibly meaningful, and I hope, it certainly reminds me, I hope it reminds everyone here, this is why it's important to do this work. This is why it's important to focus on solving these problems. It's people like Michael that we're all doing this for. So it definitely helps me all the time to hear stories like that and to know that the work we do brings hope and brings change to people who need it. With that, I know that Alan, you've also got a slide prepared, and I'm sure you want to kind of address what it is that your organization is doing to help address rare diseases. So I'll let you take it away.
Sure. So what this slide is intended to show you is that rare disease is not rare. There are lots of rare diseases, but they are more prevalent in our community than you may realize. Part of that is simply because our diagnostic tools have gotten much better, so diseases that previously were lumped into broad categories as a single disease are now recognized to be distinct. But a significant percentage of our population does live with rare disease of some form or another. And frankly, people like Michael are the reason why we formed our company. One of the things we noticed was that the time to successful completion of a rare disease trial was getting longer and longer, increasing beyond 7 or 8 years to closer to 8 to 10 years. The consequence of that is that venture capital investment in rare disease therapies was dwindling, simply because the ROI expectation for many funds is shorter. It's closer to 7 or 8 years. And so one of the things we looked at was how can the clinical trial landscape for rare disease therapies be improved in order to get good therapies to patients who need them faster. Two statistics that I always talk about in discussions like this are these. 75% of rare disease drugs fail clinical trials, which is a huge number. It's actually better than the common disease drug failure rate, though. What's even more remarkable is that of those failures, 55 to 60% are for non-drug reasons. Typically, poor trial design that resulted in a failure to recruit sufficient patients or a failure to retain those patients in trial for a variety of reasons. But the problem with that is if 55 to 60% are failing for non-drug reasons, that means you've got a lot of potentially very effective, safe therapies that never make their way to patients. So one of the things we've focused on, and I'm happy to talk about in some greater detail today, is things that we can do both commercially and on the legislative and regulatory side to speed the process to get safe and effective therapies to rare disease patients faster without in any way denigrating the important roles of the FDA's safety and oversight and efficacy oversight responsibilities. There are things we can do. It's not just a federal issue, although it's very easy for people to assume that it is. But the other point that I'd like to stress is, Michael, you said your journey was maybe not as long as others because it was only 5 years to diagnosis. 5 years is a long time to be looking for a diagnosis. It is a very challenging thing, and so that's why, frankly, we're very happy to be partnering with Trillium on this panel, because while we're focused on the clinical trial side, getting patients a diagnosis is critical. And keep in mind, one of the stats that Costa put up earlier, most of these patients are pediatric. So as frustrating as it is for an adult to experience rare disease with or without diagnosis, and it's incredibly frustrating, it is terrifying for a child or for a parent. And so it's just something we have to keep in mind, all of us. And I tip my hat to all the biotech companies in Maryland who are working diligently to help these patients. It is, a lot of them are kind of two guys, two gals, and a drug, and they hope they can get enough money to keep their research going. And so to everybody in the room who's helping with that process, thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Alan. So I think that this is a great kind of starting point for our discussion, and what we really want to focus on now is how do we, now that we've kind of seen the problems and seen the issues that the rare disease communities face, how do we, everyone in this room come together and address these things? And I think that one thing that comes to mind is we've obviously heard from a patient and patient advocate And I will say that, you know, in a previous life during my PhD, I was the person making molecules at the bench, and I never interacted with the patient. I never interacted with the patient advocate. I never knew the people suffering the things that I was working to come up with a cure for, and I think that's pretty common across a lot of early stage drug development, across a lot of, you know, whether it's a big pharma company or a small biotech. I think a lot of the people don't see and interact with the people who will benefit ultimately from the work that they do. And so, Michael, I think this is a good question for you, and obviously Alan, you can weigh in as well. How can the people making the drugs, how can the biotech industry, the pharma industry, better engage with patient advocates, and, you know, what kind of avenues do you wish existed so that people could hear your perspectives, and how can that inform the decisions that people make when they're coming up with new treatments?
When I was diagnosed in 2001, I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. We have the University of Virginia Medical Center there, a major teaching and research hospital. I've been a practicing dentist since 1990, and not only did I not know anybody with RRP, I was the only patient ENT had with RRP. There weren't telephones for RRP. There weren't little colored ribbons people were on their lapel to raise RRP awareness. There weren't clever bumper stickers, save the vocal cords. You know, there was none of that. Intellectually, I knew I wasn't the only person in the world with this disease, but emotionally, I felt like it. And I think for everybody here, these people suffering with rare diseases, they need advocates. And that can be different ways. I'm very fortunate. Again, my whole story is not the norm, but I'm hoping one day it will be. There is now a very strong RRP foundation. Kim McClellan, the president, has done a wonderful job giving resources to patients and caregivers. There's even an RRP awareness day over the summer to help raise awareness. Which I think was a collaboration between industry and the RRP Foundation. But these patients need more advocacy. They don't have a voice in so many instances. I also, to all of you all working in industry, I want to encourage you, because I know the work is hard. The work, as you mentioned, you never saw the end of any of your original research because things are so segmented and moving around. But just remember, your work matters. When you feel like you're just sort of running in circles and not getting anything done, remember me. Remember my story. It was the hard work, dedication, and perseverance of people just like you who let me sit here now and talk to you. I don't think we have any government representatives here right now, but I would tell them they have a lot of power to be an advocate for these rare disease patients. They one, can support you guys, that's huge, but by doing so, they're also, we talk about curing rare diseases. No, that's not what it's about. It's curing people that have rare diseases. These are people that don't have a voice. And I think the government officials, by supporting the industry, streamlining things, can support people who don't have a voice, their families, their moms and dads, their brothers and sisters, their husbands and wives can't support them. Last night when my wife and I were coming to Maryland from Charlottesville, we passed the Maryland state sign, and I think it said something, and I may be paraphrasing, but it was, welcome to Maryland. No one left behind, I think was the little motto. And it just really struck me as we're driving up the interstate, and you know, rare disease patients can't be left behind. You know, they need help. So, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
I think you did a lot more than that. Thank you, Michael.
Well, I'll say if today was my favorite day at work, my second favorite day was the day that I got to spend about 3 hours in our clinic in Chevy Chase just playing checkers with a 12-year-old girl who was there for a treatment. You know, I sat behind a desk for 25 years, and to actually get out there and spend time with the patient and really see what she was dealing with, but see the consequences of what we were doing or helping others to do was tremendous. I mean, and Michael, you're right. I mean, we all cannot get out in front of and with patients enough. But you know, aside from the emotional reason to do it, there are very practical reasons to do it. In the clinical trial context, for example, you know, the 6-minute walk test has been held up for decades as an important indication of therapeutic success. But for a lot of patients, 6-minute walk test is utterly irrelevant. They want to be able to get out of bed, walk to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and then walk back to bed. That's a meaningful outcome for patients. And if you don't actually talk to them, you won't actually know what's meaningful to them. And you know, it's an important lesson for all of us. Another reason to get out there and talk to patients is, you know, while the randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial has been sort of the gold standard since somewhere around the 1950s or 60s, and we can talk about kind of how ridiculous it is that that came about. There are lots of rare disease families out there who would be very happy and willing to participate in trials that are designed more flexibly and creatively. You know, using natural history studies, for example, as controls, using patient as own controls. And so I think we all need to understand the patient perspective on trial design and recognize that for patients who are staring at a death sentence, who have been struggling with the disease for 5, 10, 15 years or more, they're willing to be flexible, both for their own benefit, but also potentially for the benefit of others. But that's the kind of perspective you only get from actually talking to patients. You're not gonna get it in a classroom, you're not gonna get it in a lecture hall, and honestly, you're not gonna get it from a session like today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you bring up clinical trials and how they can be redesigned, which I know is a big focus of your work. I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on, what are specific changes that we as a community can make, but focusing specifically on Maryland, like what are the changes that we can make that would streamline and empower clinical trials specifically for rare diseases? What are the hurdles that we can overcome? Where should we be pushing?
So I think in the rare disease context, the first thing we have to recognize is that the traditional randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial conducted through academic medical centers across the globe does not work. Retaining a CRO to manage 50 or more clinical trial sites across the globe may work just fine when you need 2,000 patients for an antihypertensive or statin trial, because frankly, we could probably do a show of hands in this room and half the room would meet the enrollment criteria for a statin trial. And so it's relatively easy and appropriate in the common disease context to employ that kind of a trial design. But when you're dealing with rare disease, where in the US you have fewer than 200,000 patients, for example, where many of them are pediatric, the common disease model does not work. You're not going to be able to find even 100 patients in many cases. So we've got to think differently about numbers. We've got to think differently about design models, as I mentioned, using patient as own control, for example, leveraging natural history studies. We have to be more flexible about trial design. Otherwise, we are going to continue to have significant recruitment and retention problems, and those trials are going to fail even before they get out of the gate. The other thing I think we need to be very thoughtful about is, what does the clinical trial site model look like? So, as I said, the traditional common disease model has patients coming in and out of academic medical centers, but sometimes having to sit there for hours at a time in order to be monitored post-infusion, for example. And that may work well enough for adults in a statin trial. But when you're dealing with rare disease, when you have overwhelmingly pediatric patients who sometimes need to sit for an entire day, for days or weeks on end, keep in mind, they've got to have a parent with them. A parent or guardian's got to take a day off of work. The academic medical center model really does not work very well for that. Anybody who's had to sit with a child in an ER waiting for an x-ray knows that hospitals, for all their benefits, can be very scary, cold, impersonal places to a child. And if you're trying to keep a trial in trial, that's not a great setting. And if you're trying to keep the child in trial, you've got to provide an opportunity for mom or dad to connect to Wi-Fi and do work, because they still need to earn a living. So one of the things we're champions of is creating a new site model where, rather than having these rare disease trials conducted in academic medical centers, we think that individual sites or privately owned site networks are a better model, where the clinical trial site doesn't feel like a hospital, doesn't feel like a doctor's office, maybe has a living room, a kitchen, a place for mom and dad to do work. Sometimes we've had patients come with siblings. There are all sorts of benefits on the recruitment and retention side to looking at the trial site model differently when you're dealing with pediatric patients. I think Maryland has an opportunity to be a leader here. We've got to make some regulatory changes in order to encourage people to set up those kinds of organizations here, but not enough people are doing it. But I can tell you, we're already seeing the benefits.
That's awesome. I think that there's a lot of great considerations there that people don't think about often enough when it comes to what is the actual experience of the patient in the trial and how to make it easy for people to participate. A lot of the times that we talk about clinical trials being difficult, we talk about how difficult it is to find patients and all the stuff from like the pharma company kind of perspective as they're doing the trial. But the patient perspective is the one that I think gets lost in the shuffle a little bit in terms of what is it like to go through one of these trials. And if you're taking a drug for 2 or 3 years just in the trial, like that's a big commitment, especially if you're a child. And for the family, I think it's an enormous burden, and how do we alleviate that burden, I think, is something that recently people have been talking about more and more, but that conversation really needs to continue and to grow. There's one perspective that I think is really interesting here, and this is where I'm really missing our third panelist, because we've been talking about how do we think about the patients, how do we think about the people that are suffering, and then how do we improve the process of developing new treatments, the clinical trial process of getting them tested and approved. But there's the kind of at the end of all of that, someone has to actually bring the drug to market, it has to be paid for, it has to be covered by insurance. I think that is an aspect of rare disease treatment that doesn't get talked about often enough, and also could use quite a bit of change in terms of how we think about rare disease treatment and from a coverage or payer perspective. So I know that our panelist, who's kind of the expert in this area, is unfortunately not able to be here, but for Alan and for Michael, like in terms of Michael, your experience at getting your treatment covered or paid for, like were there any difficulties that maybe other therapies for more common diseases don't experience? And Alan, from your perspective, if you're in the clinical trial space and you're trying to get drugs approved, what kind of thought do you put into like afterwards, like if there is all the data looks good, all the lights are green, everything moves forward, like what kind of perspective does the perspective, coverage, landscape, give to people who are in the drug development game and to people like you who are in the clinical trials and bring them to approval?
Again, my story is one of the better ones. My whole treatment was through NIH, so other than, traveling to Bethesda, I had no expenses. But before that, when I was having surgery so often, and again, I'm blessed in that I had a situation where I had unlimited time off. I always had good dental insurance, I had medical insurance, but it still was a burden, the time needed, the expense involved. I think for these rare diseases, it has to be made accessible, and I don't know enough to say how that happens, but we can't have treatments dangled over patients' heads, but they have to put $1 million into it. That's not going to help anybody. So whether it's, and you probably know more about this than I do, I don't know if it's health insurance, grant money, but we need the treatments and we need them to be accessible.
Well, so fortunately, this is not something that I have to directly deal with, being in the clinical trial space. But what I'll say are two things. First, being very thoughtful about the indications that you're going after in the approval process is critically important here. If the goal ultimately is to get drugs to patients, you've got to engage early and often, in our perspective, with FDA, but engage early and often with practitioners, people who are actually treating patients, to understand what are the indications that are going to be meaningful here. I mean, the end game is not simply FDA approval. The end game, the goal is to get the patients the drugs. So you got to think thoughtfully about indications. You've got to think thoughtfully about pediatric versus adult, for example, and that only comes from early and frequent engagement from my perspective. That's probably the best answer that I can give.
Sure. Yeah, I think that both those perspectives are super helpful as we kind of think about how to, not only think about getting things approved and getting things, into the trials, but ultimately how do they actually achieve adoption and help the patients that they're meant to help. Michael, I know that you, so when Alan and I were talking just before this panel, just to get introduced, he said something that was really interesting to me. He was like, I was talking to the CEO of your company, and they were discussing some hurdles that would come up, and you basically said, well, why not just write a new law that overcomes that? And I'm a PhD, I have a whole academic background. I've never been in that field, and when I heard that, I was like, oh, you could do that? That's an option. That's a thing you can even think about. So I think that that's just a fascinating, thing that doesn't occur to a lot of people on my end of all of this. And I'd love to kind of hear a bit more about your efforts on that front in terms of how do we, inspire change at the legislative level to empower a lot of the stuff that we were talking about as a panel here.
Yeah, so you remember Schoolhouse Rock, I'm just a bill. This is what happens when you hire somebody with 25 years of legal experience and no medical experience to help run a clinical trial company. We started our company in Montgomery County for the simple reason that one of our co-founders grew up in Montgomery County, lived in Montgomery County, didn't want to commute to Virginia. Probably wasn't the smartest move from a business and economics perspective, though. And one of the things we encountered early on was that Maryland has a law that precludes physicians from having a substantial ownership interest in a licensed pharmacy, which turns out to be really problematic for a clinical trial site because it is absolutely essential to have pharmacy functions on on site. So, look, one of the first things I did was find a workaround, thanks to terrific counsel at I see some of my lawyers in the back of the room from Baker Donaldson, but Robert Wells is a terrific pharmacy law expert, and he helped me work through the law and figure out a workaround by employing a drug therapy management plan that's been approved by the Board of Pharmacy. But that's a cumbersome process. It's cumbersome for the company. It's also cumbersome for the board. So we also started thinking about, all right, how do we make this easier, not just for us, but for other clinical trial sites that might want to come into Maryland? Because realistically, the people who are likely to want to get into this line of work are physicians, or at least authorized prescribers. So we looked at the law, and we started talking to a lot of people. We talked to others in the industry, we talked to members of the legislature, and what we ultimately settled on as a group was a suggestion to create a new licensure category called clinical research pharmacy that would have all the same health, safety, wellness, anti-fraud protections as a retail pharmacy, with the caveat that physicians could and other authorized prescribers could be in ownership. And the rationale for it was, while we well understood that there is an anti-fraud benefit to not having physicians in ownership or substantial ownership of a retail pharmacy, because you wouldn't want them sending prescriptions to their own pharmacy, those concerns do not exist in a clinical research pharmacy context, because all the product that is being dispensed pursuant to an IRB approved and FDA registered protocol. Very strict limits on what the pharmacy can handle, what they can do with it. So we've been working over the course of the past year with Senator Brian Feldman, Delegate Jared Solomon, who I think really critically understand the industry as well as the legislative process. We've been working with our friends here at the Tech Council, and I'm cautiously optimistic that our bill is going to be introduced within the next week or two. But I think the salient takeaway here is, if there's something in the law that's standing in your way of building a better mousetrap, think about whether you can change it. If you can make the rational argument for it, there are partners here in Annapolis, across the state, in the Tech Council, who will help you think about that roadblock and how to not just get around it, but drive a truck right through it. In the long run, if this works, and like I said, I'm cautiously optimistic, it'll actually create more competition for us. So in a way, I should be arguing against it, but the reality is there is so much need out there in the rare disease context, but also common disease, that nobody's going to suffer, nobody's going to lose. Everybody's going to win if we just find ways to build a better mousetrap.
Awesome, and hope that your bill does get introduced soon and is successful. It sounds like a necessary roadblock to get out of the way. So with all of that, I think this has been a really wonderful discussion. I think that I have learned a ton. I hope everyone in the room has as well. I've been seeing some faces nodding along and hopefully growing understanding. So I'd like to open it up now to questions from the audience. If anyone wants to broaden the discussion, ask our panelists, or you can also ask me. But I feel like they know a lot more than I do. So any questions from the audience would be welcome.
So great conversation, I appreciate it. The humanity part of it aside, part of getting legislation passed is to demonstrate the economic impact and value to Maryland in this process. Have we been able to describe Maryland's leadership position in the rare disease ecosystem, and how doing these changes and others would continue to grow that revenue? Being able to put a dollar amount on top of the human impact amount in order to drive that story farther.
So The short answer is yes. The legislation that Senator Feldman and Delegate Solomon are going to propose has no fiscal impact, other than the potential to increase the pie for the state of Maryland. The reason it has no fiscal impact is because simply creating a new licensure category simply requires a modest edit to the licensure application, and it actually is going to, in the long run, reduce the burden on the pharmacy board staff. But what it will do, we think, is remove a significant roadblock to clinical trial sites opening in the state of Maryland. And frankly, that is a gap in our ecosystem. I mean, you know, as Kelly said, I think it was from the podium, it certainly was out in the foyer. You know, we are the third largest biotech ecosystem in the country, but one of the gaps we have is clinical trials. We have phenomenal academic medical centers that are conducting clinical trials, and we need them to keep doing that at Maryland, Hopkins, et cetera. But when it comes to individual sites and site networks, we can do a lot better. The reason that's important for the state of Maryland is we have incredible scientific research being conducted here, but it's leaving the state for clinical trials. If we can keep that money in state, we do two things. Number one, we keep the money in state. Number two, we make more trials more accessible to Maryland patients. So I think in the long run, all of that is a net positive for the state.
Have you been able to put a number on what that growth would be?
Not yet.
I would just ask you if you would confirm this point, which is that it's not only maybe leaving Maryland, but leaving the country. The competition in conducting the trials, particularly from China, we've all been seeing the rise in China, but elsewhere around the world has made it more difficult for American trials to stay in the United States. And are there things that we could do, or FDA should do, to make us more competitive?
Yeah, it's definitely happening. I mean, we're hearing from CROs and drug companies that they want us to be able to have the capability to execute trials overseas. And candidly, that's why I spent a lot of the past year trying to expand our footprint overseas, because it doesn't do me any good to have the best site in the world here in Montgomery County if the drug companies are saying, yeah, but I really have to have a site in Chile, or I really have to have the capability in Zurich. And look, there are some trials where that has to be the case. There are disease states out there where you cannot put someone on an airplane. So we get that. But there's no question that there is a bias out there that suggests you can't have, you know, purely domestic trials, and in some cases that is scientifically smart. You know, genetic variations in populations, you know, are such that it is important in some cases to be elsewhere as well as be here. I think, look, the FDA is still FDA approval is still the gold standard. It's still what people aspire to. You know, across Latin America, for example, many countries do look first to the FDA. I think that's likely to remain the case for some time. But if we don't compete better, we are going to lose some business.
And I just wanted to add to that. I feel like this goes back to something that Alan, you mentioned earlier, where you want to be thinking about, you know, what indications do you want to pursue? Because as you mentioned, some indications do lend themselves to a more global trial, and you do kind of need to get that broader swath of patients. But, you know, as you think about how can, you know, any given locality, Maryland or the US or whatever, you know, encourage more clinical trial activity to take place within its own borders, you know, where are the clinical trials that are underserved, right? What are the diseases where clinical trials are really difficult, and how can any given locality reduce the barriers for those disease trials to take place in that area? I think is an opportunity that benefits patients, that benefits companies, that benefits, you know, whether it's Maryland or whether it's the US. I think that there's, you know, always opportunities for clinical trials that are really difficult to undertake for a variety of different logistical or scientific reasons. And if there's ways to reduce those barriers, that gives, you know, places that are at the forefront of that an advantage in terms of attracting those trials and attracting those companies. So I think that there's a, you know, selectivity to be had in terms of what disease areas or indications can you really make yourself attractive to.
And you know, one point I'll add there is, though, even though Maryland itself is relatively small in population compared to you know, the rest of the union, We've seen no reluctance on the part of rare disease patients to travel to Maryland. We've seen no reluctance on the part of pharmaceutical companies to pay for them to travel to the state of Maryland. If the clinical trials site has the promise of bringing a speedier success, a patient-centered approach, they're willing to pay for it. Patients are willing to travel. We've had patients travel from all over the world to our clinical trial site. So when the disease doesn't preclude it, you know, it's like the old adage, if you build it, they will come. We just have to build it and build more of it.
So adding to that thought, how much are you advocating for remote trial monitoring? And are you doing that right now? Because that's been one of the barriers that the FDA hasn't really embraced that. And are you advocating for that? Are you adopting it? Are you doing it?
So decentralized trials, absolutely. It's critically important for a whole variety of reasons, and it can be done with good science. And I think this is another area where there are regulatory hurdles that we have to overcome. One of them, for example, is the question of authorized, what constitutes the practice of medicine. So if you've got an investigator based in Maryland and you've got a patient in Texas, and let's say that patient travels to Maryland for an initial infusion, but the protocol requires subsequent video check-ins. Is that Maryland-based PI engaging in the practice of medicine in Texas simply by connecting with the patient to conduct a protocol-designed interview? We would argue, and one of the things our bill also seeks to clarify, is that clinical research is not the practice of medicine because it does not involve the diagnosis, prescription, or treatment. But clarifying rules like that in all 50 states would absolutely make it easier to do decentralized trials and have remote monitoring.
Mr. Basu, I think this one is for you. So in your original slide at the beginning, you said that there's 8 new rare diseases that are identified per week. Is that what it kind of comes down to? There's something that I saw. Anyway, the question is, how quickly, once those rare diseases, in your experience, once they are identified, how quickly can you start that process of developing a clinical trial of projected treatment? What does the lifespan look like? Because I think some people out in the general public think that R&D process happens much quicker than it actually does, and the success of that.
That is absolutely true. And I will say, it depends widely, of course, on the disease, but one really great example might be cystic fibrosis that a lot of people in this room might be familiar with. For a long stretch of time starting in like the 70s or 80s, there was a push to band together. There was a patient advocacy group, right, that really strongly advocated for the research into a better understanding of, a better diagnosis of cystic fibrosis, which is a terrible disease that affects quite a lot of people. And it was really difficult to come up with a treatment for it. People thought, there's no way that we can do this. It involves, buildup of mucus in the lungs and very small protein channels that are in your lungs that really are responsible for the disease. And how do we possibly go after something like that? And for a long time, people weren't putting any effort into the research, into the drug development. And it wasn't really without the efforts of these patient advocates that people really started to think like maybe we can and should be doing some research into this. Maybe we can come up with a treatment. And it took decades, I would say, for the first treatment for CF to be even brought into a clinical trial. And then once that was approved, then the company Vertex that introduced the original one introduced a number of other ones shortly after. And now there's multiple options for people with for patients with cystic fibrosis in terms of the treatments that are available. But that process took 30 years to go from like the initial awareness and we need to research this more, we need some more funding in this area, to even starting a clinical trial. And as we've heard, clinical trials are not always successful, right? That is the best case scenario if the first thing you try happens to be successful for the patients, but oftentimes you need multiple shots on goal before you actually get a successful result. So even 20 or 30 years is maybe a short amount of time to go from like, we have this disease that many people are suffering from and we need some more attention to be paid to it until you get to the point of an approved drug. And that is an incredibly long process. It takes continuous, consistent effort from everybody, right? From patients, from patient advocates, from clinicians that are seeing these patients, from the biopharmaceutical community, from people in politics and the regulatory side and the payer side. Investors. Yes, thank you. Everyone's got to put in a committed, concerted effort and be aware that the return you're seeking may not come in the next 5 years or the next 10 years, but that doesn't mean the work isn't worth doing. I think CF is a great example of that. So I think I will wrap things up here by pitching it to Michael. I feel like you've got the perspective that I think is most valuable for everybody here to benefit from. If there's one thing you'd want to leave us with, one thing you'd like to see changed, what would you say to everyone in this room needs to change the most to improve how we view and how we treat rare diseases?
I don't know that I have the answer to what needs to be changed. I don't understand your work. I'm the benefit of it, but I don't really understand it. But, I said this earlier, what I will say is don't get discouraged. Keep working hard. Advancements are being made, things need to be changed to let these happen faster, but you are doing good, and don't lose sight of that. I'm a good example of that, I think whatever the obstacles are, and you kind of talked about this, go after them. There's no obstacle that can't be overcome, but it might take some time. It might not happen tomorrow, maybe, but keep going after it. Your perseverance is needed by a whole lot of people out there that are waiting.